write stuff down. I got all kinds of Post-its. When I got to do something in the day, post it in the pocket. Thanks. Mother's Day card. Ah, you know, whatever. Okay? All right. Let's go back to the study guide. Does this make any sense at all?
Yeah.
That's what I would do. I'd go to no grid in mid times. I hate formulas.
Yeah.
We should ask though, Kristen.
Where do we leave off?
19
19?
or 18.
Oh, we talked about the three performance things of grids. Oh, that was in the lab.
All right.
On break, the three of you that made up the test, I have the test here. All right, next. 19, or actually 16. Identify the three methods of measuring grid performance. We said contrast improvement factor, Bucky factor, which is also called grid factor, you know, that number of the different grid ratios. And the third one that wasn't in your book was selectivity. I want to make sure you have that in your notes, okay? Selectivity. So let's talk about those.
You just said the amount of lead.
Yeah. Selectivity is, they may call it a heavy grid, it's the amount of lead. Let's go through those. Let's go through these three, okay? So down here at the bottom, you know, contrast improvement factor, we had Bucky factor, and then we had selectivity. Kind of put it in thirds, and let's talk about them a little bit. Contrast improvement factor, the formula is on page what? 234. Anytime you use a grid, you have an increase in contrast. Does that make sense? It cleans up scatter, therefore you have more of a black and white image. Gustav Bucky came up with that when? 1913? When was it? 1913, okay? That was a few years after. But the images were so grayed out, they had to do something. We need to clean up the images. What can we do? It's always greater than 1. Let's say it's 300 over 100. Image contrast with a grid over image contrast without a grid. The contrast would always be better with a grid. So the bigger number goes on top. On a test question, you might have to identify that formula. Okay? So when you use a grid, you always have an improvement. You always have an increased contrast improvement factor. They say most grids have contrast improvement factors between 1.5 and 2.5, respectively. They're on page 234, right call. The formula is more important than the numbers. Okay. The contrast improvement factor is higher for high ratio grids. Do you understand that comment? The yellow box? As we go up in grid ratio, isn't there more cleanup?
Yes.
Yeah. That's like a filter. You know, if you, the more micron filter, water filter you have, the less particulate gets through. If you're drinking water out of some stagnant pond, I mean, a piece of cheesecloth is better than nothing. You get some of it out, not all the good stuff. Okay? Yeah. The second thing, Bucky factor. Boy, they show a couple of things in the form of the orange box, page 235. Incident remnant X-rays transmit an image minus forming X. Oh, yeah, I got a headache on that one. I like the second one there. Patient dose with a grid over patient dose without a grid. We know the higher the grid ratio, the more of the dose. Everybody understand that? There's always a cost. When you have a dedicated chest room, most Buc-ee's are 12 to 1. 16 to 1, it is so critical that you're centered to the center of it and that you're perpendicular to it. The only application of a 16 to 1 grid ratio would be in a dedicated like chest room or something. All right? Otherwise, you would have grid cutoff. The majority of Buc-ee's are 12 to 1. So Buc-ee factor, another term, grid factor. As it says there, Buc-ee factor, often called grid factor, means the same thing. That is the number that corresponds to the different grids. How do we use that? The higher the grid ratio, we use that grid factor to go up in our mass. Somewhere down the road, we'll have problems with 7 variables. KVP, distance, screens, grids. It doesn't matter which factor you do first, second, third, fourth, fifth, as long as you're consistent in doing them. Remember how we did that on the board, my little snakes?
Yeah.
You know? Doesn't matter which of those you do in the order, you should come up with the end adjustment mass, taking each variable into account. As the Buc-ee, the yellow box, page 235, as the Buc-ee factor increases, radiograph technique and patient dose increase proportionally. Questions on that? There's mud? What about the two things above that? Two generalizations can be made from the data. The higher the grid ratio, the higher is the Buc-ee factor. And I wrote those on the board. Before you go into the test, on a piece of scratch paper, write those down like I had here. I shouldn't erase those. Non-grid is always 1. Why does non-grid have to be 1? Because anything times 0 is 0. Mathematically, it wouldn't work. So non-grid means tabletop, no grid, being utilized as 1, 5, 6, 8, 12, 16. Okay? The second thing there, the Buc-ee factor increases with increasing KVP. At high voltage, more scatter radiation is produced. This scatter radiation has a more difficult time penetrating the grid, thus the Buc-ee factor increases. Maybe another way of saying that, when you use high KVP, like in a dedicated chest room, you're using 110, you have a lot of scatter being produced. So you need a higher grid ratio to clean up that increase in scatter. All right. If you have questions, please stop. Stop me. All right. Selectivity that he's taken out of this edition of the book, I want to make sure you have in your notes so they can't throw you off on a test question. Selectivity was the amount of lead in the grid. They call it heavy grid. Selectivity was the amount of lead in the grid. The more lead, the more cleanup, the more attenuation. What's the problem with that? We have this more patient dose. You should got to go up and down. Okay? So just so you know that buzzword, selectivity, was the amount of lead, or lead strips in the grid. Okay?
So it's pretty much just like a higher grid ratio.
It's kind of a combination ratio frequency. Yeah, difference. And I'm not going to go into specifics on that. Yeah. Okay. I don't want to confuse the main point. Page 2. 17, we talked about linear grid. Another name for linear grid is what? Parallel grid. Like this. I would really like to critique myself. I'd like to play that back at some point. I really have never saw a video of mine. In 17 years of teaching, people would have recorders, audio but not visual. See if I say or a every 5 minutes. You ever talk to somebody where every 5 minutes, well, you want to go here, and,
You know which one I think is